Gabby's parents' lawsuits brought to us new information that was not generally known to the public. Well, this is part 2, and we're going to focus this week on the lawsuit against the police in Moab. We're going to cover this and more in this episode of Charlie Crimebuster, what some people are calling, well, they're calling it the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals participating and do not represent those of city, county, state, or federal law enforcement agencies, nor sponsors and platforms of this presentation. The Charlie Crimebuster name and all forms and abbreviations are property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent unless or until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains adult subject matter. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. As we often say, if you're a first-time listener, welcome aboard the Charlie Crime Train. And if you're a seasoned listener, just sit down and enjoy the ride. We always invite you to reach out with a shout-out. You can reach me, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Also, we always enjoy hearing from those folks who listen every week. Sometimes you give us good ideas about other podcasts. You also ask some really good questions. And additionally, sometimes you lodge an objection. It's a safe spot. You can do that. So whether you have questions or suggestions or maybe you just want to disagree, just reach out with that shout out. Hey, by the way, let me ask you to do me a favor, if you would please. We'd like to get the podcast out to as many people as possible. Part of that has to do with those algorithms out there. If you will give us a 5-star review, that will boost that algorithm and we will get our podcast out to more people. Just a way for you to help us, and we would be most appreciative if you could do that. It boosts our signal. Also, before we get into today's program, let me remind you to reach out to peacemakernetwork.com, peacemakernetwork.com. We call them our sponsors. You know, just a couple months ago, a good friend of mine who I used to work with on one of the police departments I worked with, well, his son followed him in the line of duty and was unfortunately shot in the line of duty. These brave men and women, they put on their badge and they go out and do their job and they face danger mostly every day, every week. You and I read about public servants who die in the line of duty. So why don't you join me in supporting those brave men and women who run toward danger instead of away from danger? We're talking about military and first responders and the law enforcement.
The following podcast is brought to you by peacemakernetwork.com. peacemakernetwork.com. Audio is provided by pixabay.com. That's pixabay.com.
Well, we're into this series on Gabby Petito. We've already done one series on it. This is our second series, and we're talking about new information. New information for many, because there were certain things that were brought out in that lawsuit that was not covered when that case was going on. It was all the way back into August of 2021. That's when 22-year-old, Gabby, at 22 years of age at the time, unfortunately, she was killed by her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. And they were traveling together on a van life journey across the United States. Now that trip was planned to last for 4 months. The trip began July the 2nd, 2021, and then Gabby disappeared on August the 27th, same year, 2021. Now after Gabby disappeared, well, Brian, he raised suspicion. Yep, he raised suspicion when he drove the van all the way from Wyoming back to his parents' home here in Florida. And then he refused to discuss her whereabouts. He was then deemed by the Popo as a person of interest in the case. And then an arrest warrant was issued on charges of making unauthorized withdrawals. He used her debit card, I guess, when he was on his way back. But then Brian, he left his home on September the 13th, and then he too was reported missing. Then on September the 19th, then Gabby, little Gabby, remains was found in Wyoming. Autopsy, it found that she had been killed by blunt force injuries to her head and neck and manual strangulation. Now, we covered the Gabby Petito story in real time as it was happening, while they were looking for Gabby as she was missing. Then they were watching Brian. Then he went missing. Yep, he went missing even as they were keeping an eye on him. Now, speaking of that, there was a lot of speculation. Gabby had already been found, but they had not found Brian. He was missing. They had an arrest warrant for him, but they could not find him. And then there became a whole lot of speculation. Where did he go? Someone said they thought they saw him on the Appalachian Trail, that he was hiding out in the mountains. We know that he and Gabby camped often. They knew how to take care of themselves out in the wilderness. So many people thought that he was there on the Appalachian Trail. Somebody said they saw someone who looked like him or thought it was him. And a lot of speculation went to the Appalachian Trail. Other speculation was in Mexico, that he got a boat somewhere. Even Dog the Bounty Hunter. Yep, even Dog the Bounty Hunter, Dwayne Chapman, he came here to Florida. I've often said the dog, well, he never saw a camera he did not like. And among his thoughts, he thought that maybe Brian did have made it to Mexico. Others even talked about him boarding a boat, of course, to the Caribbean. However, yours truly, I got it right in real time as we was following this. Now, they had already searched for him near this big environmental park in the wilderness down there in South Florida, over on the West Coast, where his vehicle was last seen. And most people were sure he was nowhere to be found there. No, they had searched that. They'd gone over and over it. And they thought that maybe it was a red herring, that he parked his car there to throw people off. After all, that whole area had been searched. But living where I live today, I know how difficult it can be to find bodies here in Florida. We have all kinds of water. We have the ocean. We have ponds. We have lakes. We have canals. And we have alligators, right? Yep, alligators. Now, I kept in my mind that the most hated woman in America, remember her, Casey Anthony? Well, in her little girl's missing case. Well, in that instance, the area here in Florida was also searched over and over and over again. Right here in Central Florida, people coming from all over the world to try to find little Casey. Yet after time, she was found down the street from her house in a little swampy area that may have been covered with water when that area was searched. So I thought all along that he would be found there where his car was. They just overlooked it. And after a month of speculation, an extended search of the area around his home, well, they found him. Yep, found the skeleton there in the Creek Environment Park, October the 20th. And it was confirmed a little later in November 23 it was. It was confirmed that Brian had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. And the FBI later announced that he had admitted to killing Gabby in his notebook, which was found there near his remains. Well, at that time, people thought, well, case over, no one to try. However, I knew it would be different. Those of us who worked in law enforcement, we know all too well that following the criminal attempts to bring people to justice, well, then civil law, it'll raise up its head of litigation. And there are lawsuits, many of them. We have these guys on billboards all talking about, hey, call me, we'll sue. And often there are suits of wrongful death and things relating to the death of a person. So last week we spoke of the case against Brian's parents, where Gabby's parents sued Brian's parents. Today, we're going to focus a little more on the case against the Moab Police Department. And we're going to tell you about that case and how it ended up in a moment. But right now, it's time for us to pause, take a deep breath, and share with you our weekly brief crazy crook of the week. Well, our Crazy Crook story today comes from old Kentucky. Yep, Kentucky. Kentucky is not only known for its bourbon, or the Kentucky Derby, complete with racehorses, and of course, don't forget, Kentucky Fried Chicken from the Colonel. It's not only known for that, but as most states, it also has its crazy crooks. The headlines read this. Sarah Boglin, this one's fresh off the books, just last week. She said in the headlines, 2 Kentuckians arrested after drugs found in bag labeled. Oh, you can't make it up. 2 Kentuckians arrested after drugs found in bag labeled. Definitely not a bag full of drugs. Yep, 2 Kentuckians were arrested after drugs found in the bag. They were last arrested last week after a detective found drugs in that bag labeled definitely not a bag full of drugs. On Thursday, June the 18th, a detective of Laurel County Sheriff's Office saw 2 people inside a vehicle parked in an employee area of a local business. That's what we get from the arrest citation. And when that detective approached the vehicle, he noticed a plastic baggie which he suspected contained narcotics. And during the investigation, a woman inside the car gave the detective a, surprise, 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 a false ID card which belonged to another woman. Now, that detective also found another black bag labeled definitely not a bag full of drugs. Well, several suspected narcotics was found inside that bag. And surprise, 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 both occupants had outstanding warrants. They were then placed in arrest and they were taken to the Laurel County Corrections Center. Damon Bennett, 48, Williamsburg, Kentucky. He did get released on bail. And then there was Tricia Crawley, 51 years of age, of Williamsburg. She was charged of giving an officer false identifying information, possession of a controlled substance, first-degree meth, 2 counts for third-degree possession of a controlled substance, drug unspecified, drug paraphernalia, possession of marijuana, and controlled substance of prescription not in original container. Boy, the charges just keep on piling up. And Crawley, well, she's expected in court on June the 30th. June the 30th. Well, that's right around the corner, a couple of days from now. So these crazy crooks who made it easy for cops to find drugs in a bag marked definitely not a bag full of drugs, they are indeed Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crooks of the Week. Now, last week, we discussed a lawsuit that Gabby's family filed against Brian's parents. And it is important to remember that this was not a wrongful death suit. By the way, I do invite you to listen to last week's podcast to hear more information about this particular suit. We focused on that last week. But there's a few quick things to keep in mind about that lawsuit that we covered last week. That lawsuit was actually filed on March of 2022. Gabby's family there sued Brian's parents, not for her death, but listen to this, for quote-unquote, causing intentional infliction of emotional distress. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Now, they allege that they knew Gabby was dead while her family was even searching for the answers. They alleged that the family and their attorney remained silent despite knowing critical information that would have helped them find Gabby sooner. But I want to take a moment here and pause and remind you that there wasn't just 2 lawsuits. There was actually a 3rd lawsuit. That lawsuit was against Brian's estate, and his estate was sued, and they won in that lawsuit $3 million. But, unfortunately, it's of no consequence, because it is uncollectible. He really had nothing in his estate. So when you hear the word $3 million, you may go back and try to connect that to the lawsuit that Gabby's parents had against Brian's parents. That wasn't the one where $3 million was actually awarded. The $3 million suit that was won was against Brian's estate. This one was for a beginning of excess of $30,000, and we don't know at this point how much money was really won or what was settled in the case. Again, go to last week's and you'll find out all about it in looking at last week's estate. So now they turn their lawyers not to Brian's parents, but to the Moab Police Department. That traffic stop where they were stopped. It occurred on August the 12th, 2021 near Moab after a 911 caller, they reported that they saw a man slapping a woman outside a grocery store. And officers from the Moab City Police Department, they stopped the van, spent over an hour talking to her. Now, over an hour is a long time for a traffic stop, especially when no real arrest was made. So let's talk about that stop itself, because that's what they're suing about. Now, the officer spotted the vehicle. He got behind it. He watched it as it ran up on or hit a curb, and that, of course, gave the officer probable cause for the traffic stop. When they made the stop, the officer walked up to the vehicle, and I have reviewed this stop in its entirety. He walked up to the vehicle, and he observed Gabby visibly upset, crying, hyperventilating. And Gabby told the officers that she and Brian had been arguing, that she had become anxious and hit or scratched him during the dispute. On the other hand, Brian appeared relatively calm. He told the officers they had been arguing over stress, cleanliness, and Gabby's anxiety. Now, the officers did document scratches on Brian's face and arm. They did not observe significant injuries on Gabby. Now, because Utah law generally does require officers to identify a primary aggressor in a domestic violence incident when probable cause exists, officers then concluded that Gabby, not Brian, that Gabby was the primary aggressor based largely on the fact that she admitted that she struck Brian first and the visible injuries on him. But instead of making an arrest, instead of arresting Gabby, officers chose to separate the couple for the night. Brian, they put him up in a hotel arranged through a local domestic violence resource, while Gabby remained in the van. Well, at least that's what they wanted to set up. Now, did they remain separated that night or not? So, my friend, I got to tell you that Monday morning quarterbacking says, why did they not arrest her? It's easy for you to say, but let me ask you. If it was your daughter, would you like something like that on her record? What if that was all that happened? What if there was not the murder of Gabby? What if they just went on their way, did not have any more domestic violence incidents, and lived happily thereafter? Would you then say that the Moab police was in error of not arresting her that day? Would you say that the Moab police was in error of not arresting Brian Laundrie? Now, I'm not saying that there was not red flags in that traffic stop. There were red flags if you had the time and training to find them. They say that being a police officer, and I certainly agree with it, you have to wear many, many hats, even the hat of psychology. Now, there were potential red flags that were identified. After Gabby's death, many observers, including domestic violence experts, and an independent review commissioned by Utah authorities, they did identify several warning signs that may have deserved closer scrutiny. Number one was the original 911 report that described the opposite dynamic. That caller said they saw a man hitting a woman, not a woman attacking a man. Now, the responding officers there that day, though, to be fair, were not fully aware of the caller's detailed description during the stop. That limited how they evaluated that incident. And then another red flag was not only the call from the 911 caller, but there was Gabby's emotional state. She appeared extremely distressed, crying almost continuously. Now, while emotional distress alone would not identify who actually initiated the violence, experts say it can be consistent with someone who is constantly experiencing coercion, fear, or ongoing abuse. that can be all of that just piling on Gabby. She's been coerced by him. She's been in fear of him and ongoing abuse, and that's why she had this emotional outburst there at the scene, even hyperventilating. So that could be a real red flag. And then experts say you can contrast that with Brian's demeanor. Now note that Brian, he appeared calm. He joked with the officers. He answered their questions in a confident way. You see, domestic violence experts will caution that a calm presentation should not be interpreted as evidence someone is not an aggressor. Did you get that? Most people commonly would think this guy, man, he's got it in control, you know. He's the guy that has it in control, but you got to be careful about that because people who are abusers are very good at manipulating others, and they're very good at moving from an angry person into a calm person as part of their MO to try to hide their area of uncontrol when they get angry and lash out. There's other signs there. During the interaction, Brian had mentioned trying to calm Gabby and referenced the disagreement about the van and daily routines. Now, some people say that interaction could be consistent with somebody who's trying to control, though a traffic stop is a very, very difficult place to establish that pattern. There's another thing, though, that you can see as a red flag. Gabby repeatedly blamed herself for the incident, and she described herself as having anxiety or obsessive tendencies. Experts will tell you that victims of abuse often will minimize a partner's behavior except blame. That's very typical. So many domestics that I've been at, it always amazed me when we knew that the guy, or in lots of instances, was the aggressor, and we could see that by visible marks on a person. It was amazing to me how the woman in that situation would turn around and say, it's my fault. And then when you tried to arrest him, to take him out, you ended up fighting both him and her because she, the abused person, did not want you to take that person. So Gabby taking responsibility for people who've been around domestic violence and officers who certainly have experience or should have experience, if they've been out on the street any time at all, should know that that is typical. So Gabby taking responsibility should not in itself say that she was the aggressor. Then there's something else. Even though officers focus primarily on the scratches on Brian, maybe they should have made more attention toward the marks on Gabby, because there was some marks on Gabby. Not as glaring as the ones on Brian, but there were marks on Gabby. So what happened? There was an independent review, an independent investigation commissioned by Utah. Here's what the independent review said. The independent review said the officers acted professionally and respectfully, but they did conclude that the officers made unintentional mistakes in applying domestic violence as according to Utah's law. The review did determine there was probable cause to believe that Brian may have been the primary aggressor based on the totality of evidence. All that stuff that I went over, but it's stuff very hard to find in a few minutes at a traffic stop, including the original witness report that they did not have at that point. They knew somebody called in about a domestic, but they did not know all of the details that guy had said or who he was, or they didn't have the report before them. And then they say the investigation could have been more thorough. Now, it is important to distinguish that what was known during the traffic stop is different from what became known afterwards. At the time, officers only had the information available at the scene and had not yet connected that case to any later crime. Well, what happened then? Then Gabby's parents came and they said, well, this thing may have been stopped if they had really known what they were doing. So they filed a $50 million wrongful death claim. That should not surprise you. When these lawsuits, they always go after the big pockets, and now they're going after the Moab Police Department. They allege that officers failed to recognize those signs. They claimed that police misidentified the primary aggressor and failed to follow proper procedures. They stated that officers overlooked witness statements, that they failed to apply domestic violence protocols in the situation. Even if they thought that Gabby was the aggressor, she should have been arrested. Maybe if she had been arrested, maybe even though they might have arrested the wrong person, at least they would have been a halt in this crazy thing that was going on between Gabby and Brian. The family's attorney argued that proper intervention at that time may have saved Gabby's life. Now, again, independent investigators found mistakes were made during the stop, so the debate is over whether those mistakes legally caused Gabby's death. Well, what did the city say? The city comes back and they say this. They say that these officers actually acted reasonably based on what they knew at the time. Now, I've said often, folks, it would just be great if we had these crystal balls that were there in police in police vehicles, that you could look at this crystal ball and you could kind of predict the future, or you could look back at the past. Well, I know that the modern era, we would say it would be great if we could travel through time, or maybe we had a time machine and we could go back and we could look at all these situations that happened with Gabby and Brian. Or we could go in the future and we could see that he would one day put his arms or hands around her neck and strangle her and hit her with something. It would be great if we could see into the future, but cops do not have a time machine. We cannot travel in time to the past. We can only look at that information that is right there at that time that we can see. And I've been in those shoes. I know how it is. I know how puzzling it can be when you go to domestic, sometimes even to find out who the aggressor is. It's he said, she said most of the time, and those are hard things to find. So, what happened? What happened in this suit? Well, government immunity. Protection becomes a central issue. In November of 2024, a judge dismissed the case under Utah's government immunity laws. The judge did say that the family had a plausible argument that police actions could have contributed to the outcome, but in this situation, immunity prevented liability. Immunity prevented liability. And, of course, the family did appeal, and that case went later to the Supreme Court for a review. So, this really was it was beyond money. The family statements repeatedly emphasized that they were interested in reform and accountability, and we understand that. They even have an organization now, a foundation about domestic violence. This lawsuit did give us ideas to really think about how police are handling domestic violence calls and the responsibility of family members after a crime. What should they do? What responsibility do people have when they know the truth? That was a lawsuit against Brian's parents. What responsibility did they have when they know the truth? They remained silent. The law says you can remain silent, but should they have been responsible to let her parents know that she was gone? Can you imagine being Gabby's parents when they did not know where she was? They did not know if she was hurt. They did not know if she was dead. But then the lawsuit against the Moab police said, what responsibility do institutions have when these warning signs appear? Well, folks, the bottom line is this. For Gabby Petito's family, that criminal case ended with Brian Laundrie's death. The civil suits, though, they became something else entirely. We looked at a search for accountability, looking for answers, and the hope of course, that future tragedies might be prevented. So what lesson do we get? We get this, my friend. If you are involved in a toxic relationship and that relationship gets violent, you need to get out of that relationship. If you know somebody who's in a toxic relationship and there's violence involved, you need to do what you can to get that person out of that relationship. There are a lot of great resources to help people who are involved in domestic violence, and it happens all the time. When you're watching these crime programs on television and you're watching it online, why do over and over and over again you see that the first suspect is always the person's spouse, father, mother, son, daughter, a family member that's close? That's because of domestic violence is at such a height in this country. So if you see something, say something. Encourage those people to get out of those relationships. Well, folks, I want to thank you for being a part of the Charlie Crime Train today. And until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert. For the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Peacemaker Network, and also encourage you to support the first responders, military, and law enforcement personnel by contributing to the Peacemaker Network. That's peacemakernetwork.com. All music and sound effects are courtesy of Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com. You can also support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, tag @CharlieCrimebuster, and then click the subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be notified each time we drop one of our shows. Another more convenient way for you to listen to our podcasts, or for you to say to your smart speaker, play Charlie Crimebuster. If you have comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you, so please send them to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us again for another exciting crime episode with Charlie Crimebuster.